any case, they found no inscriptions either inside or outside the Great Pyramid, or indeed in any of the other pyramids at Giza. And indeed, as Graham pointed out, and I will emphasize later on the Sphinx, these monuments are totally and utterly anonymous. And here comes the question. If we are dealing with powerful, megalomaniac, eccentric kings who wanted everyone to know how powerful they were, where is their names? Why did they not tell us who built those monuments and why? It does not make sense. Now, if there is an Egyptologist in the crowd, I would be told immediately that this is not quite true. Above the ceiling of the king's chamber, as you will see later on in other slides, there are 5 so-called relief chambers. Egyptologists are not quite sure what these chambers are about. But in any case, in 1837, when these chambers were discovered, the discoverers announced that they had found graffiti written supposedly by some workmen, and on one of these graffitis, the name of Khufu, Cheops, apparently could be read. There is a lot of doubt as to the authenticity of this graffiti. It has even been suggested that the explorers who opened the chambers above may have hoaxed it. And they had plenty of reasons to do so. They had been researching there for months on end without finding anything. And it seems that they might have thought that at least they would have proved who the pyramid belonged to. In any case, fraud or no fraud, basically faint graffiti with the name of Cheops put there by some unknown worker scribbling in some poor red paint. Graffiti. And Egyptologists sit on this data. They consider it more than enough to attribute this monument to King Cheops. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we go by these standards, then many buildings around the world, Empire State Building, Canary Wharf, and perhaps the public toilets in Trafalgar Square belong to somebody called Kilroy. Certainly not enough evidence to allocate 6.5 million tons of archaic high-tech so easily. The next problem you come along to face is this. Well, where is King Cheops? No bodies were ever found either inside or outside the Great Pyramid. To this day, King Cheops is nowhere to be found. Neither his remains, or his treasures, or his tools, or anything at all. Nothing. But Egyptologists, again, are satisfied that they have found King Cheops. And you're looking at him here. It is a statue that was found 600 kilometers, miles, 1,000 kilometers to the south of the Great Pyramid. And on this statue, again, faintly inscribed what looks like the name of this king. You're looking at a rather enlarged photograph of this statue. If you look at my fingers, it is about that big. We're supposed to go home because the mystery is solved. This is it. We have found King Cheops. Here he is. He's in a little glass box in some corner of the Cairo Museum, passed by and ignored by all the tourists because they can hardly see that puny little thing representing the great builder of the Great Pyramid. Again, very flimsy evidence indeed. But is it possible that the pyramid builders and their monuments were not mute? That they did speak eloquently? That they spoke most powerfully, but not in the language that Egyptologists are accustomed to, that they spoke the universal language that we would call today scientific language. And let's examine this possibility. Because one thing that you will also read in Egyptological textbooks is that it is a fact, it is not a question of theory, it is a fact that the Great Pyramid is perfectly constructed in scientific manner. Let me explain what this means. You're looking at an overhead of the Great Pyramid. It is set on a square base, an area of 13 acres, a gigantic area. Apparently, you can put 22 tennis courts in that area. It's enormous. The side of that square measures 230 meters, 750 feet. Were you to walk all around the Great Pyramid, you'll be walking almost a kilometer. That is what you're confronted with. But that square is so perfectly square, so perfectly set on the ground. The angles of each corner is as close as, damn it, to 90 degrees. And in order to achieve this then and now, we need to apply very, very careful surveying techniques. I speak, I must say, with a certain amount of experience. I'm a construction engineer, and I've set out monuments myself and buildings in very difficult conditions. And I can tell you that you need a very good surveyor with very good instruments to do this. One of the things you need to do, once you've set the rough corners of the square, is to ensure that the square is perfectly locked with the diagonal. And that is how you know that you've got on the ground a perfect square. But here is something odd with this monument. Because when they built the monument, they left an outcrop of rock measuring 7 meters high, a bit lower than the ceiling, but certainly high enough for the builders not to be able to see across the diagonals. To cut a long story short, what this means is that we're dealing with very, very good surveyors. Very good surveyors, because they achieved what we today would have difficulty in achieving in those circumstances. We've got to accept this as a matter of fact. What is also a matter of fact, and most incredibly still, is that they set this square such that each face is perfectly directed to a cardinal point, a cardinal direction. This means that this face, this is the eastern face, is directed perfectly due east, due south, due west, and due north. Here is this dark blob that you see here is the entrance of the Great Pyramid. And you will see that all the corridors, galleries, chambers, and shafts, as you will see, are directed along the north-south axis, what we call the meridian axis in astronomy. To such a precision that, again, we are astounded today. 5% of a single degree. That is Swiss watch precision. Take it from me. And therefore, we must contend with something else, because you cannot achieve this precision. Not then, not now. Unless you aim at the passage of a star along what we call the meridian axis of the sky. You need a pinpoint of light to aim at to get that kind of precision. Not the sun, not the moon, not a piece of stick. It can only be done with the passage of a star. It is, again, a fact. Let me explain what this means. You know that am I blocking the view there, by the way, because I keep walking around? The stars, the sun, the moon, the planets, all rise in the east. And they rise and culminate at the meridian. They reach their highest point in their transition at the meridian every day. And then they slowly descend and set in the west. This monument there is no doubt, is locked to the passage of a star at the meridian. The question is, which star and when and why? Now, having driven the point that the pyramids of Giza do not have, actually I'm being interrupted by a wonderful show here of some lady taking her clothes off. It's quite incredible. I'll have to move here. I'm serious. Having driven the point that the pyramid builders of Giza did not use hieroglyphic texts, but seemed to be using astronomy somehow to express themselves. Not one single word. Here you come to another anomaly, another problem. You're looking at pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty, the kings who followed immediately the Giza builders. And clearly, you're looking at shabbier, poorer, much less well-constructed pyramids. Here is one, for example, that has totally collapsed, hardly looking like a pyramid at all. Nowhere near the quality and size and precision of their predecessors. But unlike their predecessors, these pyramids are loaded with hieroglyphic texts, from floor to ceilings, hundreds and hundreds of hieroglyphic texts. Now, the question is, what do they say? This is the logic of investigation. And not surprisingly, as you look into those texts, you will find that they speak of the sky, of the stars, and particularly of a constellation, the constellation of Orion. And they identify the constellation of Orion with a deity called Osiris. And that this region of the sky where Orion is, and you will see other constellations as well, they call, or at least it's translated here by the Egyptologist who translated this, the netherworld. It's the wrong term, really. It's too hazy for me. They actually have a word for this, the ancient Egyptians. They call it the Duat. And when they mention the Duat, they mention a specific area of the sky. And at this stage, we know that it contained Orion. And therefore, now we have a cue. We have something to carry on with our investigation and see if these stars have anything to do with the star that we're trying to find linked to the Great Pyramid. Now, here is a curious passage in those pyramid texts. We have the king, identified to the deity Osiris. I will explain why in a moment. But here is the interesting thing. We have the pyramid identified to Osiris, the construction of the pyramid identified to Osiris. Now this is very interesting, because if you make the transposition between Osiris and his stellar counterpart, Orion, then what we're being told here is to look into a connection between the pyramids and the constellation of Orion. That, again, is the process of investigational logic. Now, what we seem to have here, unavoidably, is a hieroglyphic language veiling a more powerful, a more scientific language. I will coin the word astroglyphics. We have hieroglyphics veiling astroglyphics. That's what we've got. Now, let's see what this means. Let me explain what you see, because those pictures are rather small. Here is the Giza necropolis with the Sphinx and those pyramids, anonymous but containing powerful astronomical alignments to the stars, and seemingly related or inviting us to relate them to something to do with the constellation of Orion at this stage. Whereas here, we have the immediate later pyramids with chambers loaded with hieroglyphic texts. And what we should normally do, according to my logic, is that we should take this allegorical language of astronomy and put it back in its original images, in its original glyphs, if you like. They're astroglyphs, to look at the parts of the sky which they invite us to consider and try and make sense as to what they're trying to tell us, and particularly what these people were trying to do. This is the right approach. I will give you a similarity between the kind of work we do in construction and this approach, the scientific approach. I'm a construction engineer, as I've said, and I've built many projects around the world. And the way we do it is this. We get drawings given to us by an architect. And these drawings bear signs and symbols and mathematical symbols. And our job is to convert these back into the original idea, to actually build what the architect had in mind. What he doesn't want us to do is to look at these drawings and write a story about them, write a book about them. We are simply taking them in the wrong direction. And I give a little analogy as to how this kind of problems work. As children, we all played a little game, we used to call it in France the broken telephone. If I whisper a distorted message, or very faintly in the ear of this gentleman, are you awake, sir? Yeah. Sitting there, and he would pass on the message by whispering down the line and so forth and so forth. By the time he gets to the last person on the row, it is all distorted. We know how this works. We used to play this at school. That's the trouble, is if you take it in the wrong direction, what he should have done, if he didn't quite understand it, is to make me repeat what I said. And this is basically what we're asking, or they're asking us. We have to get back in the right direction. Well, the problem is that this isn't at all what classical Egyptologists have done. When the coding of the hieroglyphic texts was broken in 1822, it fell into the hands of classical scholars, classical academics, most of them at the time studying cultures like ancient Greece and so forth. There was no science of Egyptology, as a matter of fact. And overnight, the science of Egyptology, we are told, was born. Being classical academics, what they did was to take these texts and translate them in classical languages and in our own modern languages, in English, in French, in Italian, in German, and that is what they did. And what they've done, really, is they've taken it in the wrong direction, because it suddenly began to appear to them as some sort of bizarre mumbo-jumbo of superstitious priests writing about the skies and their pharaohs in what appeared to them totally incomprehensible means. So there are passages there, I'll go very briefly, because this is a typical example of the sort of thing that happened and is still happening. There's a passage that reads the Duat, this region that we have identified to the region of Orion and to Osiris. The Duat beats your feet to the dwelling place of Orion. And another one has been translated as the Duat beats your hands to the dwelling place of Orion. Although we can still discern the astronomical lingo through those translations, they begin to get distorted. They appear, indeed, to be some mumbo-jumbo. That is what you get. And really, what we've done is, for the last 15 years, we've been arguing that the direction is this way. But the classical Egyptologists refuse to consider this direction, for the simple reason that they don't believe that the ancient builders were any good astronomers. Indeed, that they knew very little about astronomy or any science as we understand science today. That is the problem. But it stands out like a sore thumb that the people we're dealing with here not only knew about astronomy, as you will see, but could understand the way astronomy, the skies, could be used to convey information and messages through the ages. So let's examine that possibility. Let's see what the ancient Egyptians themselves had to say. And what they tell us with force, one thing they insist upon over and over again in their texts is that their civilization was a legacy from the gods. That they got their civilization handed down, brought down by the gods. And this is how they tell us the story. They tell us that the universal deity, Atum, who manifested himself in the sun as Atum-Ra, self-created a couple. In turn, this couple created the earth goddess, the sky goddess and the earth god. And from the womb of the sky goddess emerged 4 anthropomorphic, human-formed, stellar deities who were sent down to earth, and 2 of them, Osiris and his sister wife Isis, became the first rulers, the first divine couple to rule the land of Egypt. A land and a kingdom established in a period they call Tep Zepi, literally translating as the first time. They established a kingdom of the first time in Egypt. Tep Zepi, what we would call today Genesis, the kingdom of Genesis. Now, we are told too that this kingdom, this divine kingdom of the first time, was established in the region that today we call the Memphite necropolis, the Memphis region, where today stands the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. So this is what they tell us. We have to read their texts, and this is what they tell us. Now, we are faced with a sort of Hamlet story. Osiris was killed by his brother, his jealous brother, and his body was cut into 14 pieces, scattered all over the land of Egypt. And his wife, Isis, was left without a child, without a successor to take over this kingdom of the first time. She gathers back all the pieces of the body of Osiris, brings him back to life using her magical powers, and becomes pregnant. And eventually she bears a son called Horus. Horus is the first god king of Egypt. And it is from Horus that emerges the divine line of kings, of pharaohs of Egypt, the Horus kings. They believe themselves to be the reincarnation, the bodily reincarnation of Horus, the sons of Osiris. That is the myth. This is what they tell us. Meanwhile, they tell us what happened to Osiris. They tell us in no uncertain terms that he departed back to the gods, back to the sky, and established another kingdom in the sky, another kingdom of the first time. And this kingdom they called, as I've said, the Duat. The Duat. So let's have a good look at this Duat. They are attracting our attention to a part of the sky with great significance to their myth, their genesis. Here is that part of the sky, or part of that part of the sky, and you can see the constellation of Orion. I'm having problems with my pointer. I wonder if somebody can get me another one. I'll use this one meanwhile. The constellation of Orion, with the characteristic 3 stars, the belt stars, of Orion's belt. And you can see the constellation of Orion. The 3 stars of Orion's belt. And here you see the star Sirius. It was identified to Isis, the consort of Orion Osiris. When she died, she too became a stellar deity and joined Osiris in the duat along the banks of what they call the winding waterway, which they identified to the terrestrial Nile, the Milky Way. And this is the setup. The duat encircles, as you will see, another constellation on the other side of the Milky Way. And this is the constellation of Leo. So this is the region of the sky that we are asked to know, to understand, and to see what it has to do with the pyramid builders. And this has nothing to do with the pyramid builders. And I'm inclined to crack the standard joke I have. I will do that because it always works. I hope I get a giggle from you. I keep saying that Graham Hancock puts this slide to put me off in my talk. It's a kind of little standard joke we have, you know. And I'm kind of confused, and I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do now, to stop the talk or what. It is something that I'm sure a lot of you may know what it is. It is not a cheap Mexican postcard or one of those praying rugs. It is known as the Acerebo interstellar message. It is the first message sent by us, mankind, to the stars in an attempt to communicate with a possible civilization outside our galactic system. It was transmitted to M13, a galaxy 25,000 light years away from us. Now, I don't know why they didn't choose some